Under normal circumstances, a 0-0 draw played out at Tannadice Park, the home of Dundee United, would barely register on any football fan's radar.
Kenny, Edouard, deft touch, Elianusi, it's Laxall! Another powerful strike, which flew into the side netting.
But this time around, things were different.
And that is that at Tannadice. But it's not about Dundee United and Celtic now. It's about Rangers.
At the start of this season, Celtic were on course to achieve a long-coveted goal, 10 in a row, a decade of consecutive Premiership titles.
The day has come, the day is here, the wait is over. Rangers are champions of Scotland and Celtic have rubber stamped it for them by failing to win here.
At the end of this season, however, they find themselves without the record, without a manager, and without the goodwill of the fan base, who have been sorely tested in recent months. In this episode, we ask, what has gone wrong for Celtic Football Club?
Considering the context of A, how important the season was, and B, the resources and financial advantage Celtic have had for so many years now, and add to that this range of off-field embarrassments, the behaviour of the manager, the complete breakdown in relationship between the club management and fans.
Christian Wulff talks and writes for the Cynic, a Celtic fan media outlet.
Taking all that into consideration, I think you can make an argument for this being the worst Celtic season in modern times, especially for the fans.
Could you give us a short overview of how Celtic's season has gone this time around?
Purely on the numbers, it's really bad. Celtic are 20 points behind with 6 games to go. That's the furthest away they've been from the title since 18 points behind in 94-95. It's the first time in 20 years they've gone 3 consecutive seasons without qualifying for the Champions League group stages, having been eliminated by Ferencváros in the second qualifying round. They were humiliated twice by Sparta Prague, the lesser Prague side, in the Europa League, where they conceded 19 goals in those group stages. Like, only 2 teams have done worse in that competition's history. They lost their incredible streak of winning every single domestic Scottish trophy over 4 seasons by losing 2-0 at home to Ross County, one of the worst teams in the league. And the only really bright spot was completing the quadruple treble by winning last season's Scottish Cup in December. They still needed penalties to beat second-tier Hearts in that final, having actually gone behind in the penalty shootout as well. So on pretty much every front, it's been very bleak.
Tavernier to take it, Goldson with a flick! And Rangers have scored already! A pulsating start to this blockbuster derby!
So it feels as though there are a couple of turning points across the course of the season, both on the field and off the field. As far as the league is concerned, it seems like a loss to Rangers in October had a really negative impact on the club's domestic form.
Celtic won 8 of their first 9 league games. But even so, their form wasn't great. If you look at their XG differentials, especially compared to Rangers at that time, they were pretty far behind. There was quite a gap up to Rangers. The 3-5-2 that had come in with Shane Duffy, there were some clear issues there, one of them being Shane Duffy and his performances. They needed some late goals to beat Dundee United and St Johnstone. But up until the first derby, Celtic had kind of got away with one results. I think Rangers had lost 2 more points at that point as well. Now, the Rangers defeat on the back of that international break, things like Odsonne-Edouard being out with coronavirus and so on, but it was an absolutely disastrous game. Probably one of the poorest derby defeats in a very long time. It was the 3rd derby in a row where Steven Gerrard had tactically outfought Neil Lennon. And I think the next 2 months after that, Celtic only played 3 league games. They drew away to Aberdeen and Hibernian in the league, which in isolation aren't terrible results, and they beat Motherwell. But within that period, between the two derbies, had some disastrous results in the Europa League. 2 4-1 defeats to Sparta Prague. They lost to Ross County in the League Cup. Then Dubai happens, and I think everything else that comes after Dubai is completely influenced by that week and the decision to go there.
Football and elite sport more generally enjoys a number of privileges right now that the rest of us don't have. And it is really vital, obviously for public health reasons, but I think also out of respect for the rest of the population living under really heavy restrictions, that these privileges are not abused.
Off the pitch, the club hit a real nadir with Celtic's decision to go on a winter training camp in Dubai at the beginning of the year. Why did this go down so badly?
I think it went badly down for, if you want to call it the wrong reasons. So Celtic had just lost the derby. They had probably lost 10 in a row. And the importance of 10 in a row is probably can only really be understood within the context of Glaswegian football. So at first it was kind of why are they going there on a wee holiday when they've just lost this momentous season? But Celtic got flack, I would say, for the right reasons, because pretty much every single club in Europe decided against going somewhere in the sun for a winter break. Even Bayern Munich, who has a close relationship with the Qatar government, do not go on a winter trip there. Scotland has just gone into pretty severe lockdown just after Christmas. And within hours of Celtic touching down in Dubai, you see pictures of Neil Lennon and Scott Brown sharing a pint by the pool. You have pictures of players having a good time, socializing in a way that in Scotland is not allowed in terms of COVID restrictions, sitting inside around a big table watching the football. Add to that the fact that when they come back, Christopher Jullien tests positive for COVID. And Christopher Jullien at that point was on a long-term injury. And the club's stance was that, we need this training camp to improve the team's form because it'd been working well the last couple of seasons. But then why bring an injured player with you unless this is a team-building exercise rather than an actual training exercise? Jullien's COVID test means that about 11 first-team players needs to isolate for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, Celtic draw twice. When the players come back, they have a game 2 days after where they draw again. Essentially, the season is over. But to make it even worse, when Neil Lennon comes back after staring at a wall for 10 days, having been in isolation, he has one of the most preposterous press conferences you'll ever see a Celtic manager give.
Can you talk us through how the last week's been for you?
Interesting, watching the media and the fallout and the attacks on the club. I have a question for you, Charles. On your live show last week, you had Andy Walker on live saying that our winter training camp was a jolly. Can you explain to me what he meant by that?
I can't explain that.
Why not?
That would be probably words that Andy would probably want to discuss with you. I wasn't involved with that live.
You can't go on a public platform and spread lies and insults about my professionalism, my players' professionalism.
Everything is the Scottish government's fault. It was the right decision to go. There's not an ounce of, even this is a couple of days after Peter Lowell had gone out and apologized for the trip, a very non-apology. But Neil Lennon comes out and just has one of the worst press conferences a Celtic manager has ever seen. And the Celtic is headline news across Britain. And everything that could go wrong with that trip went wrong. And Celtic deserve every single flack and criticism they got for it.
And as far as Siger, oh, what a wonderful finish that is. David Siger gives Ferencváros an early lead at Celtic Park.
One other turning point that we should talk about that you've mentioned already is the failure to qualify for the full Champions League competition after losing to the Hungarian side Ferencváros, as you said. How important was that as a turning point for the club as well?
In any other season, if Celtic goes out of the Champions League before the group stages, it brings a dark cloud over the club. I think this season, because there was so much focus on 10 in a row, it was almost put slightly on the backside saying, that's not good. We have to get back to that. But this is the 10 in a row season. What I think was a big catalyst in a negative way for this season is playing in the Champions League is important for Celtic in terms of finances, but also in terms of attracting players and having that shop window. What happened after the Champions League loss, though, was that Neil Lennon went out in the post-match press conference and accused a lot of players in the team for not wanting to be there, and maybe they should just go. And it was the first of many times where his mask slipped and he blamed everything on some of the players. And I think the effect that has on the team puts an added pressure on specifically 4 players that had 2 years left on their contract, then got Celtic into a really bad cycle of manager blaming the players. And then while the dressing room has been quite bulletproof in terms of leaks, it was clear that it was not a great relationship going on between the manager and at least some of the players.
A lot of the blame for the Celtic season has been laid on the door of Neil Lennon, as you've been saying. Is this entirely fair?
It's 100% fair. If anything, I don't think there has been enough blame. And I say that because pundits, many who are former teammates, comes up and makes excuses. You know, the fans have been calling for his sacking for many weeks. They were told they were spoiled. One BBC journalist labelled some fans bedwetters on Twitter. Neil Lennon is a mediocre football manager who's already passed his shelf life when he was appointed for the second time, especially working with the quality of players he is at Celtic. He's tactically incurious. His former Hibs captain Marvin Bartley this season says he doesn't greatly believe in tactics. And what was once seen as his strength, his man management, it's become a very two-edged sword in terms of he might fire some of the players up, but he'll rub a lot of players the wrong way as well. I think the anger towards Neil Lennon this season isn't solely about him not delivering a sporting goal. That is not great, but in a way, the anger towards Neil Lennon this season is his behaviour while failing to achieve that sporting goal. His behaviour is what's led the fans to be so angry with him.
In the end, Neil Lennon was sacked at the end of February. Do you think the club should have acted sooner? Would it ever made much of a difference this season if they did?
This is one of the main points where a lot of fans are very angry against Neil Lennon. Ferencváros is one point, but I think it was always unrealistic that he would go at that point with the season so early. The horrible displays against Sparta Prague showed something was very wrong, in addition to those draws that kept coming in the league. But the really indefensible point in the season where he should have been sacked, and probably at the last point where this could have been turned around, was after Celtic lose to Ross County in the League Cup 2-0. After that game, there's fans' protests outside Celtic Park. Players are kept inside the stadium because of the anger outside. But at this point, they're still only 5 points behind in the league if they win their games in hand. So most of the damage so far had been in the Champions League, in the Europa League, in the League Cup. And everybody expects Neil Lennon to go at this point to save the season. But why doesn't he? So the speculation and some of the leaks in the press says that Dermot Desmond, the majority shareholder, and Peter Lowell, the CEO, don't want to, quotation marks, cave in to the fans. And there's some very disparaging remarks in the press about the fans and so on. So the club seems to be in free fall. And I remember saying at the time that if the club hierarchy decides to keep Neil Lennon to what seems to be proving a point towards the fan that they won't back down to protest, is that if they keep him on in the next league game against St Johnstone, they can cause irrevocable damage to the season and this sporting achievement 9.5 years in the making. And true enough, they keep him on. Celtic draw the next league game against St Johnstone at home. They're 7 points behind in the league. In many ways, I think that's the sliding door moment. He could have gone after that game. It could have been salvaged, but they didn't do anything.
I think it's impossible to talk about what's gone wrong at Celtic without going back to a point at which things were going right at Celtic. That obviously brings us to Brendan Rodgers and his tenure at the club. What do you make of the Rodgers tenure looking back at it now?
Rodgers essentially moulded the club into a professional club on so many levels, to the required level. The only blind spot probably being in the recruitment process. Now, the previous manager, Ronny Deila, probably had a lot of the same ideas and philosophy, but he didn't have the experience, the gravitas, the skill of Rodgers to implement it. The problem is that is when it's the manager who drives that and who is behind it, and not somebody like a sporting director or a technical director who sets that precedent. When that person then goes away, you're always at risk of the standards slipping when he's gone. The way Rodgers is left is why most fans have a difficult relationship. Because he went in February instead of that summer, the board got away with a lot of things. And there had been a lot of anger towards the board if he left in the summer. Brendan Rodgers is an excellent manager, and he was very much the key in setting those standards that I think it's clear now, 2.5 years later, that have slowly slipped until we saw this total collapse this season.
We also need to talk about the Old Firm rivalry as well, because at the point that the Celtic league winning streak began, Rangers were relegated down to the 3rd division of Scottish football. They didn't make it back into the club until 2016. I wonder what impact do you think that this deflation of some of the pressure on Celtic in the Premiership had on the club long term?
This mention of the Rangers pressure, if Rangers not there, Celtic kind of loses focus. I think it's very misunderstood. There is an intense pressure to be 1 point ahead of Rangers, but that ends up being the main focus. So having Rangers in the league becomes a circle of short-termism, but there's also a false sense of achievement. If you achieve being 1 point ahead of Rangers, everything's fine. And that's the main goal. It drives your decisions around transfers, to play youth players, in terms of who you give a contract to, your choice of managers, and so on. So having one team in the league who's about your quality, it doesn't do much in terms of the general league quality, but that kind of pressure of always being 1 point ahead of them leads to short-termism. Rangers not being there was a golden opportunity for Celtic to widen the horizon, to put together a new kind of structure, something slightly more medium to long-term, more focus on youth, different transfer contract strategy, different choice of managers, essentially modernize and become a leader in every single football department. That happens in part because they hire Brendan Rodgers, but they don't hire Brendan Rodgers to do that. They hire Brendan Rodgers because there's a Celtic connection, an Irish connection, and they lock into that appointment. It's not a predetermined strategy by the board to do that.
So there will be a new manager appointed at Celtic Park this summer. Is there any indication of who it will be at this point?
It's really hard to tell. I think and I hope Celtic is waiting to decide on the manager before they announce director of football / technical director. Maybe they wait even until after the new CEO, Don Mackay, is set to come in on the 1st of July. But the discussions around what type of manager Celtic will have has a lot to do with that internal restructure. Because there's one train of thought where you say you need a safe pair of hands with so much else going on in the club. And the prime example of that is Steve Clarke, the current Scotland manager. Somebody says, if you bring in a new structure, you need a younger, more progressive, modern outlook, a head coach that focuses solely on the team. Enzo Maresca, the Manchester City under-23 coach, is the most hotly tipped candidate in that kind of mold. And I think what the fans kind of see as the preferred choice, kind of like a Goldilocks between those two, is Eddie Howe. But what kind of strand the board and whoever is making this decision, because per the moment Peter Lawwell is the CEO and nobody's really sure who's going to make the next appointment, whether they'll wait for a director of football to come in or so on. What direction they go in is still very unclear from a fan's point of view.
So if I were to ask you the question that we began this episode with, what has gone wrong at Celtic, how would you answer?
There's two words that comes up. It's short-termism and it's sentimentality. There's a belief that Celtic just have to do enough to be 1 point ahead of Rangers. They're happy, the board and the management, to run the club at 80% of its capacity instead of trying to aim for 100%, to try to be a leader, to try to be as progressive as you can in all fields. Instead of being in a way almost incurious to new trends, they're not far behind the curve, but Celtic is definitely not a club that's in front of the curve. That approach, almost a safety first approach, brings success because of the huge financial power Celtic have, both domestically and even compared to other European clubs. But it's a club that can be so much more. But the focus is being 1 point ahead of Rangers, and that's enough.
So at the moment, your outlet, the Cynic, is running a series called Celtic Vision, which is calling for a complete overhaul of the football operations at the club. Could you talk to us about the current system of football operations of the club? What's your issue with the current system?
The main issue is that the men who decide finally on football matters, that set the culture, they're not football men in terms of they don't have the experience or the proper knowledge to do those decisions. So that's the CEO, Peter Lawwell, who's a corporate man, a financial man, an accountant, and Dermot Desmond, who's the owner. There isn't someone with sufficient football knowledge whose focus is on the medium and long-term plans of the club to define the culture, to define the DNA of those football operations. in essence, it's not a modern operation. You need somebody between the CEO and the first team manager who focus on the medium and long term. And there just isn't somebody with that required knowledge that do that.
So how are you proposing that the club overhauls this system then?
That layer between the CEO and the first team coach / manager is crucial. I personally would like somebody who's a proper technical director, who has the full overview of the club, who sets the goal and the plan and makes sure those ideas are integrated throughout the club. Nobody working in a silo is all joined up. It's not rocket science. It's not revolutionary, but both who you choose as that person to do that job and the structure you put in place, the scope of that role, it's such an important decision and such an important summer for Celtic.
So fundamental to this restructuring is the idea of the club following a model. What do you mean by a model? And can you give us an example of some of the clubs that you think have those models that Celtic could emulate?
We talk a lot about the Ajax model, the Salzburg model, the Porto model, but Celtic is unique. You can't take any of those models and transfer it directly to Celtic as a club and its situation. That is because of its history, its fans, and those fans' relationship to the club and its players. So Celtic need to take the best of those models and find a recruitment and squad composition model to fit Celtic. So how do you mix buying your own talents, especially from abroad, and selling them on for a profit within 3-4 years? But also, how do you mix that with buying and keeping more established players that spend their best years at Celtic? That's Scottish players and that's foreign players. I don't think you can have a big an overhaul in players as you have in Ajax and Salzburg. All clubs need to have a very special relationship with their players, but fans almost demand that there are certain players in that team that spend their career at Celtic. Add to that, how do you properly mix in academy players to become both first team players, but also squad players? So there's things that they can take from Salzburg, from Ajax in terms of that, buying players, selling them on, developing youth. But you also need this idea that Celtic is a huge club. And for some players, a one-player club is also integral. So they need to buy in different market and to be able to mix that. So I guess you need a Celtic model.
I wonder if you think that Rangers have had a head start here in terms of setting themselves up in a more sustainable system to the future and how that sort of impacts on what Celtic have to do going forward.
Rangers have closed the gap on Celtic financially, but I don't think they've done anything specifically revolutionary in doing so. They have achieved their aim this season. I think they've worked really well in terms of having a clear tactical plan on the pitch for the last 3 seasons. I think Michael Bale is a big part of that. But they haven't really brought lots of youth players in or sold any of their players they brought in for a huge sum of money. So how good that Rangers model is yet to be proven. I think Celtic have just as much skill and clever people in the club as Rangers have at the moment. They just lack the structure and somebody to bring it all together. What could be very important is that Scotland is at the moment likely to get an automatic Champions League group stage spot for the league winners from not next season, but the season after. If Rangers can keep ahead of Celtic in the next 2-3 years and actually get 2-3 years worth of Champions League group stage money, that's probably where the bigger worry is in terms of actually then opening up in the financial gap. But that makes it even more important for Celtic to put in place the right structure and to do things differently, because Celtic will still have enough money to have very good players in the team. What they need is a structure and essentially a head coach to make those players better than the sums of their parts. Rangers now is a team that is better than the sum of the individual players, and Celtic is a team that is a lot worse than the sum of the individual players.
You also talk a little bit about scouting and use of data as being important to develop this Celtic vision that you're calling it. How far behind the curve do you think Celtic are in this regard?
In terms of being behind the absolute leaders in football, a good bit behind. In terms of Scottish context, yes, I don't think they're far behind Rangers, if far behind at all. There's definitely been some improvements over the last couple of seasons. Nick Hammond came in, some of the analysts that's been brought in, the quality of analysts there. I know the club has finally gone beyond the Instat/Wisecat level of data access. And again, the overall focus is the issue. How joined up is this? How progressive is it? How curious is it? Is it done just because that's what should be done? Or is there an actual clamor and an ambition to make that work and make it integrated? This summer's transfer window is a good example. How the club end up loaning Shane Duffy, a player so obviously doesn't fit the style and play of the club, but they can at the same time go out and make what on the surface was at least some out-of-the-box transfers in terms of Albion Ayeti or Vasilij Barkas, who's a completely different profile of player. That was clearly done by a different process of recruitment and so on. Maybe not as successful, not all as successful as I wanted, but there doesn't seem to be a great joined-up thinking. So I think the tools are there. I think a lot of the good people are there. It's just not a drive to do it in a holistic and integrated way yet.
How much hope do you have that the club will actually implement these sorts of changes then in the long run?
If it's been the same people in charge, I wouldn't have too much hope. Specifically, I mean Peter Lowell and the Dermot Desmond trifecta. Don Mackay is coming in to replace Peter Lowell. So he's an interesting new appointment. And I think he is somebody who's at the same time will bring in a director of football, somebody underneath him to have that level. Dermot Desmond cannot have a day-to-day influence in this club when it comes to sporting matters because he doesn't have the knowledge to do it. And he's been a good benefactor for the club, but I think he's also been a hindrance to the club. So this moment now, with the absence of that pressure of 10 in a row, which in a way have held the club back in many ways. The club has kind of been in this bubble until 10 in a row was achieved, until the bubble burst. This is the moment for Celtic to grasp this. And if they can't grasp this now, when can they? They blew the opportunity when Rangers were liquidated. They need to start turning those wheels into a much more modern structure this summer.
So what does the future look like for Celtic then, do you think?
I think this summer will define Celtic immeasurably over the next 10 years. It could plod along, happy to win the league every other year, maybe a couple of seasons in a row, or Champions League group stage qualification, happy to run the club a bit below its full potential. Or it can finally try to embrace this new structure, strive for something else than being 1 point ahead of Rangers, even explore the opportunity of a very changing football landscape. Instead of maybe being guaranteed 6 group stage games in Europe, it's looking more and more likely that 10 and 12 might be the norm. That would fit Celtic very well as a club. If Celtic can play less league games and more games in Europe, that fits the club very well. Might not fit the league very well, but for Celtic as a club, that is also a very good opportunity that comes along almost at the same time as they hopefully put these restructures in place. So if they do the right things now, and if the football landscape in Europe changes to a way that fits them better, I think the potential of this club is enormous.
You can find Christian Wulff writing and speaking about Celtic over at The Cynic. The music for this episode is provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and the details for the individual songs can be found in the show notes. This episode was produced by myself and Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.